And what I'm saying in my text is, no, in fact, you guys are the mainstream. There is no right-wing force. The book I'm quoting from is literally the most popular high school textbook in the country. The 1619 Project, for example, has a curriculum that's been adopted by thousands of schools around the country. I wanted to take a look at that and see whether there's any evidence that they're telling the truth more than, quote unquote, we did back in the day. And what I find is that the answer to that is definitely no.
Today we got Dr. Wilfred Reilly, who is an assistant professor of political sciences at Kentucky State University. He's also co-host of Cut the Bull podcast, author of numerous books, including his newest book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. And in your book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, there's 10 lies. Mm-hmm. And lie number 4 is hippies were the good guys. The sexual revolution was great for women, and the Vietnam War was unpopular and pointless. I think this is the one that came as the biggest surprise to me. Can you explain lie number 4?
Yeah, I can. So one of the things that I think most people have heard is that the movement of the 60s was kind of this golden age in American history. And I joke about it in the book. I say, Shaggy, hitted and crotched flower children spread the message of a better world to a disturbed, imperfect country and so on. But the reality is that that's not entirely what happened. Like, there were good things that came out of the 1960s Cultural Revolution. Like, I don't think anyone thinks that actual middle-class Black civil rights were bad. Like Martin Luther King, that sort of thing. I don't think anyone disagrees with those. But the first wave of feminism, like women can have bank accounts and jobs and so on. But the reality is that most of the stuff that came out of the 60s was, in fact, extremely negative. So like hardcore violent Black activism, like BAMN, By Any Means Necessary, Malcolm X on Beyond to Stokely, all those brothers, that was a residue of that era. Extreme anti-white racism became popularized in that era. Nation of Islam began in that era. Let's not forget the white rioters who were just as prevalent. Like, I'm from Chicago. The 1968 Democratic Convention riot was a working class white riot, cops against the Weathermen and those boys. And all of that, which grew into 1999 Seattle, which grew into Antifa, Black Bloc, more properly named. That came out of 60s rebel culture. And more serious things like the anti-war, anti-draft movement that frankly lost us the Vietnam War came out of the Cultural Revolution, the drug culture. And I suspect you and I both partied a bit in college. And it's cool to do cannabis strains and all that. But like really the Ken Kesey, the Merry Pranksters, PCP, cocaine during the entire decade of the 1980s, like that wasn't cool. That ruined the lives of people I know that you probably know. Overdoses hit 100,000 last year, concentrated among sort of young, cool men. So, I mean, that's a disastrous thing that came out of that era. And just on and on and on. I think the big one that's never talked about is sort of the eco-freako movement, because that went anti-nuclear. There was a lot of Russian money designed to prevent the West from really going into effective nuke. It would have reduced dependency on Russian oil. And I also think there tends to be a mental collation that people make between nuclear power and nuclear weaponry. So there's been a huge, huge amount of money wasted on boondoggles like ethanol and biodiesel and even wind, while nuclear power plants have set unused or been destroyed even in countries like Germany. And I mean, I think that's killed millions of people. If you look at the number of cold deaths over the years since the 1970s, or you look at climate change is real, although we overhype it. You look at some of the effects that that's had. So all of that comes out of the 1960s Cultural Revolution. And when you ask, well, why do we talk about this in such positive terms? Why is it all just like, Martin and John Lewis marching arm in arm with like a white librarian from Vermont? The answer is because the people that write the books about it are almost entirely upper middle class, white sort of social chroniclers. And they see this through this golden lens. Like they were the people getting screwed in the mud at Woodstock. They were the people who saw the last concert from the Stones. Well, it's not the last concert from the Stones anymore. Those SOBs have been touring since I was a kid, right? They went back out there. But I mean, they were the people who saw the allegedly last, Altamont performances from some of these great bands. They saw Hendrix go electric and all that stuff. And so, I mean, there's that golden patina that they have over an era. But I mean, in this chapter, I actually talk about what some of this stuff, what the Haight-Ashbury scene was like when the merry pranksters started experimenting with LSD and PCP. And there were people in the streets that were taking these new benzos and were hunting cats for food. And I say these kind of rebel movements are rarely good, and they weren't good here. Now, the second part of your question, I don't just want to ramble on for 15, but you talk about the sexual revolution. Now, this is, again, it's like the drug thing where most people enjoyed this during their college years, and you feel a bit like a hypocrite with your business suit on now as a fat 40-year-old saying, oh, terrible. I mean, anal sex became popular. There is an element of silliness and hypocrisy to this, but the simple reality is that right now, one of the defining features in middle-class white and black culture, I can't speak for every group in the country, but is the collapse of the family. So 70% of black kids born out of wedlock. For all white kids, it's 38.5%. For young white kids, it's over 50%, well over. That's with Caucasian Hispanics thrown in, but I mean, they are white. So for those kind of core American groups, and if you add in whites and white Hispanics, blacks, that's almost all of the country. I mean, that's a massive disaster. And when you look at the things that came down the pipe and caused that, like a 50+% divorce rate, the surge in African-American illegitimacy from 11% when Walter Williams first wrote just before World War II to 23% at the time of the Moynihan Report to reach peaks of nearly 80%, 72, 73% or higher. Those things are the product of that same period of social transition. So, I mean, from the hippie movement in the 1960s, we got the idea that, for example, polyamory is totally normal. From the midwave feminists, we got the idea that women should, forgive the language, fuck like men. You should spend a period of time experimenting, taking a certain number of partners. People suggested up to 15 or 20. The language girl boss was first used then. The language ethical slut was first used then. And I think there's nothing wrong in life with not marrying your high school sweetheart, with having 5 or 8 lovers and going to college and so on. This is true for women as well as men. But the full-on sexual revolution with the plaster caster groupies and the 1990s rave scene, which I was part of and so on, was obviously way more than that. And I think a lot of people saw the negative effects of that, where people racked up extraordinarily high, quote unquote, body counts, where people discounted marriage itself as a patriarchal institution, where people decided that single motherhood was great because of what everyone on the left suggested that we do with the welfare system, Cloward Piven, which we did for 20 plus years. The overall down road impact of that, however enjoyable some of it was, especially for young men, was pretty bad. And I think it hit women the hardest. So one of the things that I notice about pretty much every set of statistics that I look at today is that today's girl bosses, like the women who describe themselves as feminists and who would describe themselves as having an average, quote unquote, BC of 7 to 12, and who would describe themselves as, I have one child, father's not present, and so on. They're not especially happy with that set of affairs. I mean, there's a graphic that I posted to my social media today, but which is just standard Pew level data, where they track the total fertility rate, the marriage rate, and the rates of mental health and mental stability for women from 1970 to today. And the TFR, the total fertility rate for each couple, each two-person heterosexual couple, that's fallen from 2.5 to something like 1.2 today. It's 0.7 for upper middle class Americans, if I recall correctly. So that is there. I mean, the rate of marriage has fallen dramatically. The average age of first marriage now is 32 for males. It's 29 for females. Peak human fertility, it's awkward even to talk about it, but is 23. So those are totally messed up. But I mean, happiness, this is one that kind of surprised me before I started writing the book. You'd expect like a couple raving together and then going home and having, ketamine boosted sex to at least be happy. They're at least getting something out of partying, right? But like that's not what happens, at least the next day, beyond the next day. So you saw there was the level of depression in like the pure 1950s. Your husband's a war veteran. You guys are probably mutually abusive. But as you get into the 60s and 70s, that second wave of feminism, you saw men and women both get very happy. They're still in marriage relationships and the abuses are pretty much gone. And then as you start seeing the post-60s stuff take over, you start seeing that drop. So I'm going to keep the hand here, but it just goes down, 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 and craters in the mid-00s, craters when social media takes off, and now it's up a little bit. But fertility rate is down. Age of marriage is up. Marriage rate is down. I don't have it in front of me. I try never to make up stats. But I think it's fair to say happiness is at near all-time lows. So when you talk about that sexual revolution, like let's reject marriage, that's patriarchal, like let's reject long-term love relationships. Men and women should both go chase each other as much as possible, from the singles bar to the rave scene to the festy to Tinder. And there's also that like 40% of people that don't have enough game to compete in this, that would have done fine in the church, but that now are kind of the incels and femcells, like we're just totally excluded, like who are not going to get on an app and come up with some witty joke like nothing dry but my wit, and then start talking to strangers, but who also don't have the kind of almost wholesome in-person bowling league life you would have in 1960. So find themselves like hemmed in with gaming, pornography, the female stuff, different literatures, weird hobbies. And there's nothing evil about that, but it's just, so you have this 60% of the population that's going real hard and that's not getting a lot of happiness out of it. And then you have this other chunk of the population that's not doing anything. Number of romantic partners, 0. There's a recent finding, a number of men that have never approached and talked to a girl. I think it was 35%. This is males up to 30. So I don't think that is a good thing. And last sentence, because I tend to be like a long, assertive talker, as you're noticing. But like the whole situation, the sexual revolution and those results, I think was by and large bad. And we can now look at some of this stuff and we can take the golden patina away. Like we're the sons of the people that marched on, Selma, and say, look, it's good we can all vote, but now we need to go back to getting married. We need to start doing this stuff that you destroyed.
So we just talked about lie number 4. Lie number 2, I thought, tied the entire book together. And I also thought lie number 2, which is the Red Scare was a moral panic that caught no commies. I think that also tied your other book, Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. I thought that kind of explained a lot, because basically Hollywood is like the propaganda arm for like the U.S. elites, whatever, quote unquote, the U.S. elites, whatever that means. But you have Hollywood acting like the whole McCarthyism and the Red Scare was fake. And like you say in the book, a lot of those actors and a lot of the people that were accused of being commies in the 1950s were in fact commies. To this day, if you say McCarthyism, it has such a negative connotation to it. I mean, it's almost a slur. But are you able to talk about lie number 2, the Red Scare?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think they're two slightly different things there. So you're talking about my first book, Taboo, or second book, Taboo. And I think in that book, I'm making a point that is pretty important. But a lot of topics are things that in normal upper middle class life, you're just not supposed to talk about at all, except to affirm kind of platitudes that come from the political left. And the point I make in that book is that a lot of those platitudes from the political left are just complete nonsense. So like chapter 1 takes on the Black Lives Matter movement. And, I have no patience for, I don't think George Floyd was killed by the simple pressure of a 140-pound cop's knee on his neck for 10 minutes. But I also don't think that was an example of great policing, where there's this guy who's clearly overdosing, he's clearly having a heart problem, and you still got him in a fighting hold. He's down there on the ground. I don't have a lot of patience for actual police brutality, but I think that the narrative that was painted around these isolated incidents of police killings and so on was complete bullshit. So, I mean, the Black Lives Matter narrative, if you want to get into it and remember what was said, was that there were hundreds or thousands, I think that's fair to say, of unarmed poor men, but particularly black men, being murdered every year. So, I mean, Cherno Biko, who was one of the leading spokesmen for BLM nationally, went on primetime Fox News. This is one of the 2 examples I usually give. and said that every day, basically, an unarmed black man is murdered. Murdered was the word that he consciously chose to use. And he was not the most prominent person to say things like this. I mean, Ben Crump, who's probably one of the best known lawyers in the country. I mean, he's the guy who shows up like an Andean condor every time someone is, shot by the cops, run over by a cop car, whatever. But I mean, he actually published a book called Open Season, The Legal Genocide of Colored People. And I mean, if you look at the definition of genocide, he'd have to be arguing that there are tens of thousands of black people being killed, at least indirectly, by some kind of government shenanigans. Okay. But anyway, so, I mean, this was the argument. And when we actually started looking at that, I was one of a couple of competent social scientists that took a look. Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute was another person that did very definitely. Rafe Mangel is another person that comes to my mind. But Roland Fryer is kind of the OG in this space. I mean, he wrote a complex, very quantitative paper on this. But I mean, so when people actually started looking at this, what we found is that the total number of unarmed black men that are shot by the police every year, getting to the point, is like 10. And there's actually a database of this now. There's the Washington Post Killed by Police database. So you can go in every year from 2015 to 2022 and look at the number of unarmed brothers that were gunned down by serving law enforcement officers. Last year it was 12. So in chapter 1, I point out that we're being openly told by people who are just screwing around with the figures. Like they're using the total number of police shootings and saying black men are overrepresented or something like this. We're being told that this is happening, and it's not. Every single case where a black man is the victim is being highlit, and that's not happening with people of any other race. At one point, I actually did a Google search where I think I went through the first 100 pages of Google with cookies deleted first, and I looked at the number of police shootings of people of different races that were given high-profile treatment. Like they were highlit on the first set of pages. And it was like 2 Hispanic cases, 4 white cases, people like Dylan Noble, and 36 black cases. So what you had was exactly what you described, like the people who were in charge of the media apparatus presenting this false narrative. And I went through other chapters that made that kind of point about similar topics, like interracial crime, where, I mean, I guess in one sentence, violent interracial crime, at least traditional interracial crime, where you have a black perp and a white victim, or a white perp and a black victim. One, that's 3% of serious crime, what we call index crime. So there are about 20 million index crimes a year. That's violent crime and the most serious property crimes like burglary, carjacking. And of those, 600,000 fit the definition that I just gave, that's 3%. But of those violent traditional interracial crimes, only 90% of them are black on white. So the pattern is completely the opposite of what the media chose to present for multiple years. So Taboo is talking about how there's this whole category of things that you're not supposed to say. Like there's almost no interracial crime, if you view that as an indicia of oppression. And when interracial crime does occur, because there are more whites and they have more money, it's almost invariably black on white. So that was that book. But I mean, I think with the latest book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, you've drawn this really interesting connection where you're saying, well, the reason that these lies are propounded so often and so effectively is that there are these people that have a certain narrative in mind that have been in charge of kind of the information generating apparatus, if you will, for a long period of time. And I think that's correct. So like the Red Scare chapter, I mean, I actually mentioned that there was a movie called Trumbo that came out a couple of years back, 5 years back or something like that, and that won a number of awards and that tells the story of this guy who's presented as kind of beleaguered. Like a well-known film writer, small film director is accused of being a communist. And so he loses his livelihood and he's forced to write behind the scenes for other people. And he's rather presented as kind of this harassed artist who the government is going after because of his liberal political beliefs. This is America. There are a lot of analogies drawn to more recent Republican political leaders. The problem with that, though, is that Dalton Trumbo actually was a communist. And so the point I make in chapter 2 of the book is that, in the late 1990s, when we were fairly friendly with Putin and the Russians, Yeltsin and so on, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we actually gained access to a lot of what are known as the Venona cables, which are the declassified communiques between Russia and her spies in the West during a whole sweeping stretch of the Cold War. And one of the things we found out is that there were Russian agents all over the West. There were something like 600 names mentioned in Venona, and I would say not all, but most of them are spies. Like, they're actual spies with code names and handlers. And most of the kind of cause celebs of the Western left, like I'm sure you know Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Alger Hiss, where Whittaker Chambers wrote that entire book, Witness, so on. Most of them are recognized, known Russian spies. So the question you're bringing up is kind of who's the hand behind the hand behind the hand behind the throne? Who is the person in charge of our media and in charge, for that matter, of sectors of our academia that's making us not know this? And I think I tackled that question, but I think it's an interesting, fascinating question that more people should look at.
And both your books, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me and Taboo, especially in Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, is that in the intro chapter, it's like people are told that you have this right wing, people that love America is telling history in these textbooks that kids are reading, students are reading. But in fact, it's not. It's people like Howard Zinn, and people almost think they're being provocative and cool, like bashing on America, when that's the establishment view. It's not the non-mainstream view to bash America. It's been the establishment view since, I don't know, I would have thought maybe since like the 70s or 80s. But when you're talking about the Red Scare and all that being whitewashed in the 1950s, like when did bashing America become the mainstream legacy media view taught in textbooks around all 50 states?
Well, I mean, the hippies were rich kids in the 1960s, so maybe about then. I mean, it's something, you're right, and that's well said. It's something that's been going on for a long time. I mean, there's an article that ran in Commentary in 1968 called My Negro Problem, where the author, who I guess would be like, Norm Podhoretz, it would be like the grandfather of the guy who owns like the Jewish Review magazine today, but was talking about how like he supports civil rights in the Deep South and so on. And everybody does. But when people talk about the oppression of Black people, and he mentions a couple other groups in passing, Italian Americans in modern New York City, he doesn't see that. Like, the problem that he had during his interaction with working class Black kids was that he used to get his ass kicked by them. Like, there used to be a lot of neighborhood fights between pretty much equally matched working class groups of kids, and the Jewish kids would lose like 2 out of 3. And he says, like, you ought to consider these different range of experiences. Like, where I live, we are all growing up in these working class, ethnically diverse communities. We're all fighting each other. We all have, I know there's discrimination against Blacks. We all have pretty similar access to jobs, at least through like the upper blue collar, middle white collar sector. And most of this is true. And it's a little weird to be told constantly that there's this brutal oppression going on. Like, we live in the North. So back in the 60s, decades ago, apparently this storyline was coming out. I'm pretty sure in a Jewish school in New York, that was what was being said. And there were people reacting to it then and saying, well, like in Brooklyn, I don't really feel like I'm all that privileged. If I see a Black or Italian guy, I've got to fight him. Like, I don't really feel that I am the guy holding him down as a Orthodox Jew. I mean, so this storyline's been going on for a very long time. So, I mean, I think the way I would summarize it is that the primary narrative in the United States right now, again, in the middle and upper middle class, I'm sure there are small religious schools somewhere that are teaching the lost cause narrative about the Civil War. But in the middle and upper middle class, in the massive textbooks like An Unfinished Nation that I review for this book, the primary storyline is that the political left is in charge, and they are talking about how the political right is in charge, and people need to be sort of de-radicalized. That's the main thing that's being said. And that's what inspired me to write this book. So there's a genre of at least 10 books that do what I just described. So there's obviously Lowen's Lies My Teacher Told Me, where the author talks about the things that were traditionally, and I mean, this is like many things they say on the left. This is true if you go back enough years, but they were traditionally part of the U.S. educational system, reification of Columbus. There weren't many Native Americans and they were savages, this kind of stuff. But beyond Lowen, I mean, there are books by Indians. So there's Vine Deloria's, what do you call it? It's not Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Oh, Custer Died for Our Sins. There's the other native brother, what is his name? But it doesn't necessarily matter. It's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, A Native History of the United States. And that book is literally just 400 years of native military defeats. And kind of the joke there is, well, the natives won about a third of the time. Like, do you list any of the victories? Because otherwise you're kind of wondering why the war took so long. But it's one of the first of those books that's just like negative, 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 negative. This is our history. Do you guys have any giant reservations today? No, pale face. How dare you ask? You know, it's just that's the narrative there. There's the 1619 Project, 1619. It's not called a Black history of the United States. It's, what is it, a new origin history of the United States? On and on. I mean, Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And the narrative in every one of these is sort of, this is the worst country in the world. It's part of the worst culture in the world. We enslaved Black people and genocided natives and were abusive to women. Every marriage included a great deal of marital rape. By the way, the idea that all housewives were abused until, say, 1970, in that era when women were in charge of the rat poison and guns in the house and the average woman had 5 brothers, like, there's not a lot of empirical evidence that's true. Like, we've kept track of the mental health of men and women since probably the 1930s, certainly the era of the alienists, and it's declined during most of the period that we've been looking. So I'm sure there were women that were horrifically abused at the margins, but like in these close-knit communities of 10,000 people, like most people seem to have been happier than they are today. I'm sure husbands and wives might have occasionally slapped, punched each other, done terrible things, but that would have generally been reconciled. And I'm not sure that's worse than dating 20 people between ages 16 and 30 and winding up without any of them. But moving on from that topic, I mean, the idea is we are the worst of cultures, but then you get into the slick talk, which is, and no one's telling you that because of the control of our society by this sort of right-wing force, but I'm going to explain it to you here. And what I'm saying in my text is, no, in fact, you guys are the mainstream. There is no right-wing force. The book I'm quoting from is literally the most popular high school textbook in the country. The 1619 Project, for example, has a curriculum that's been adopted by thousands of schools around the country. You can find it by Googling 1619 curriculum. And I wanted to take a look at that and see whether there's any evidence that they're telling the truth more than, quote unquote, we did back in the day. And what I find is that the answer to that is definitely no. And if I can make one more comment there, I think there's an important general point here as a political scientist. Real revolutionaries generally aren't popular executives. I talked about this with my students the other day, and a young woman named Erica McFeeters actually helped clarify this a little bit. I don't know how thrilled she'd be about her name being one of these podcasts, but an impressive young lady. But I mean, real executives generally aren't, or real revolutionaries generally aren't popular Robin DiAngelo style executives doing speaking tours about how oppressed they are. So when you hear someone talking constantly for a large amount of money about the problems they face, it's a pretty good sign that those problems were problems in the past but have been resolved, or they're at most very minor, or that person is in fact in charge. So like, I mean, Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project claiming that the roots of America lie in slavery, the country is still incredibly racist, racism is in our very DNA. I mean, that was published in the New York Times Magazine. So it's sort of, that's a self-refuting argument. Either the country is extraordinarily biased, Miss Hannah-Jones is barely making it, or she's a popular New York Times columnist. There's no world in which those two things exist at the same time, I think. So that's worth pointing out.
I thought it was interesting in your book where you mentioned that Karl Marx was surpassed as the most written about thinker in academic humanities in 1987. So they're basically saying, or the left is saying, that the right has controlled the narrative, but it sounds like Karl Marx being the most written about thinker until 1987. It seems like Marx was obviously the most written about thinker. You then basically say that Karl Marx has been replaced by just other founding fathers of cultural Marxism. How does cultural Marxism kind of differ from traditional Marxism?
Okay, so I think that there are a couple things. I mean, first of all, in the interest of honesty, as I recall, one of the thinkers that replaced Marx was Nietzsche. So right off the bat, I mean, there were some thinkers that are associated with the right that are surging past. But yeah, I mean, one obvious point, yes, for most of the recent history of philosophy and sociology, the most cited thinker was Marx, as in Karl, as in the founder of communism. So the idea that through the 60s and 70s, we were run, at least in the academy, in the prep schools, in the media, by goose-stepping, jack-booted goons from the corporate world. No, that's simply not accurate. And also, beside Nietzsche, I mean, the 10 most cited, I think, are like Foucault, Derrida, bell hooks. I mean, I'd have to pull up the list. But so, I mean, most of the people that have replaced Marx are probably to the left of Marx. So Marx is, logically enough, a Marxist. He's an economic or a vulgar Marxist. Critical theory or critical race theory, in my opinion, essentially what it does is take the basic paradigm of Marxism and replace the class analysis with bullshit analysis based around something other than economics. So the core idea of Marxism to me, and this is openly just a smart political scientist analyzing it from out of field, but it's not the nonsense economic theory about widgets and so on. Marxist production theory is just wrong. In fact, most of Marxist theory is wrong. Like the parts I professionally analyze as a poli-sci guy, all the predictions are inaccurate. Like the idea that the peoples of the world are going to unify along class lines and throw off national governments, that simply didn't happen. Then the idea the nations of the periphery were going to unify against the nations of the core. You can't even define those things. Like, is China one of the peripheral nations? What about India, South Africa? What about all the BRICS, the most powerful alliance probably in the world? But anyway, did they all unify to fight the West? No. But anyway, leaving aside the limited predictability of the actual Marxist dialectic, quote unquote, wink nudge, the thing that Marxism really does contribute to the world is the idea, which I think is taken more from Rousseau than anyone else, that what we see in society is an illusion. It's a trick. So the facial neutrality of society is in fact designed by one group, the upper bourgeois, to manipulate pretty much everyone else, the proletariat, the lumpen proletariat, even the petite bourgeois. So when you see something, and the example both Rousseau and early Marx give is property rights, that seems totally neutral. Like if you have a house, you can keep that and no one can enter that and no one can take that from you without your consent. That, in fact, is designed to protect the rights of the small group of people that own homes. So Marx's idea is that everything that seems facially neutral is designed to benefit the rich people that are, in fact, ripping off society. And dozens of ideas come out of this. Like if you're a poor person that thinks you will be rich and so supports an organized system of law, you have false consciousness. If you enjoy working and don't recognize that some of the value of your labor is being taken away to support another class of people, you have false consciousness and you do not recognize alienation. And it just goes on and on. But anyway, what the rest of critical theory does, in my opinion, is take the rich man that's at the top of the Marxist analysis and just replace him with another big bad if you play video games. So like in critical race theory, the rich man is replaced with the white man. So like all of society is structured to benefit white people, and every gap in performance that you see reflects white supremacy, as opposed to all of society being structured to benefit rich people and every gap that you see reflecting class privilege. So like critical race theorists will say there are performance gaps on the SAT, and that implies to me that standardized testing is used to replicate the conditions in previous generations where whites dominated at elite colleges, for example. There's a book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, where the author says bluntly, the criminal justice system is being used to replace Jim Crow as a tool for the incarceration of Black and Latino males. I.e., we don't have a justice system to lock up rapists and wife batterers and so on. We have one because otherwise the Negroes would get uppity and you'd just have Black people, I don't know, working and protesting and so on. So you need to create a number of fake crimes and incarcerate Black people for them. Now, I'm going to pause here and say that this is just nonsense. Like, obviously, society slants to some measurable degree, usually 3 or 4%, in the direction of people in various powerful groups. This can include the smart, the good-looking, the rich, the social majority, so on. But most systems are, in fact, pretty fair. And there are ways of determining whether a system is necessary for humans and pretty fair in political science. Do you see it in societies around the world, for example, like standardized admissions testing? Within a specific society, do you in fact see the dominant group doing the best? And in the USA, we don't at all, actually. The top performing groups on the SAT and the GRE, as I understand, are East Asians and then South Asians and then Nigerians. So the theory, I think, is bullshit. Like, I'm very openly like a center right to right business consultant who thinks this is all drivel. But so like critical theory, I'm really going on with this, but so like critical theory, okay, critical race theory, white man replaces the rich man. Feminism, fourth wave feminism, the male replaces the rich man. So like marriage is a system that's designed to give men access to as much sex as we want and to ensure the domestic slavery of women. Now, to the average husband who sleeps with his wife twice a week and finds that she enjoys it just as much as he does, is that real? No, but again, the idea is that this must be the case. Everything is structured to oppress. Queer theory, society is structured to benefit sexually normal, attractive people, and you really could just go on down the line. But there's actually a dispute on the left, last point, between people who are traditional economic Marxists, like people who say, well, the division in society, all these things can matter. But the division in society is between rich people who make all of us work for $10 an hour cleaning toilets and everybody else. And then these other people who say, well, no, you don't understand. I am a 1/8 Black, neurodivergent, virgin, Muslim. So I actually can speak over you despite the fact that I went to Barnard. And that's becoming an ugly fight if you've ever been in any left-wing debate circle.
So your book had 10 lies. I imagine there had to be significantly more. So how did you narrow it down to just 10? And if you had, say, like a part 2, what would be some of the lies that were like, oh, I almost want to put this one in, but you just didn't have enough space to put it in?
I mean, I think the answer to part 1 is just I had an editor. Like, one of the things that I really recommend like young talent do is work in organized spaces first. Like, I have a lot of friends, whether they're edgelordy type white guys, or they're like hotep Black dudes, or they're just anything like young feminist girls who also rap, who are in that internet world where those three would like go at each other all day. And I mean, you make a decent amount of money, but there's no one really controlling your content. You're like Twittering, you're Substacking. And I think that that's a useful add-on to what you're actually doing. But I like working in spaces where people can kind of check what I'm saying, actually. So like I'm a National Review columnist of all the like buttoned up things, and I'm dressed like one right now. But I actually teach at a college and I submit to pretty major journals. I mean, Bob Moranto, Pat Wolf, and myself published in one of the major kind of public administration journals earlier this year. A bit awkward, but I think it's Administration and Society. I don't have it right in front of me. But I mean, and I think when you're doing that, when you're at that level, when like K-State or NRO or something is like looking, I mean, this is HarperCollins, Broadside's owned by HarperCollins. When like HarperCollins is looking at what you're saying, they're really going to kind of cut out some of your bullshit. So they took me down to 10. I mean, that's the answer. But what would I put in if I had a chance to do unlimited lies? I think one that I had in there was the Crusades were a Western response to Muslim aggression. And that didn't really fit in with the rest of the kind of race and gender stuff. But I mean, I think it's worth pointing. I do think it fits in with the historical theme of like, look, we were no better and no worse than, I mean, Saladin was quite an honorable Muslim opponent. But when people say like, how dare you go into the part of the world owned by the men of Islam and kill, the reason for that was that the Muslims had prior to that point been conquering without much response much of the world. I mean, following the death of Muhammad, the Arabs conquered a bunch of the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire. They conquered into Europe. They conquered Spain. That was, in fact, the partially Black Moors, which is something that there's a lot of racial back and forth about online. They conquered parts of Italy. The different group of Muslims conquered parts of Eastern Europe. I mean, there are Caucasian Muslims in Moldova, Albania, parts of Serbia, Bosnia. So in response to these massive conquests, obviously Turkey is now a Muslim nation. So, even Constantinople eventually fell to Islam. Well, that was in 1400. So in response to these kind of massive attacks, like the fall of entire cornerstones of Western civilization, Byzantine provinces, the Westerners finally counterattacked, and that was the Crusades. So, I mean, you could easily paint the Crusades as a heroic attempt to recapture the Western Holy Land. I mean, Jerusalem is, I think, the fourth holiest place in Islam. It's obviously in the West, the birthplace of Jesus, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, all of that. So that was going to be one of the things I talked about from a Western perspective. I also was going to do something on gender, where just like the idea would be that I have no real objection to people living their life as they want to, but the idea that it's hard to define sex or that there are 200 genders or something like that is as idiotic as anything that's been thrust into the public debate, no pun intended, over the past 20 years. And I mean, I think that this is something based on actual polling I've done that no one believes. It's just something that's become very third railish that no one wants to talk about. You've seen people like Riley Gaines have a career ended and then another profitable career begin just on the basis of discussing this. So I wanted to put that in the book and go up to 12. I guess those would be the first two.
Dr. Wilfred Reilly, as you are an actual professor of political sciences at Kentucky State University, you are around college students. What is the reaction that your university students have to not just this book, but to all your books, which kind of have some themes that overlap?
Well, I think everyone asks this, like, are you hated on campus? Or do people like darkly love you and come to your office and ask to be mentored by you? The reality is that it's pretty mundane. I mean, Kentucky State University is a historically black college. So that means most of our executive team and most of our faculty is black. And I think that eliminates a degree of the excuse making that you sometimes see from, frankly, black executives and faculty members at PWIs, primarily white institutions, whether those are colleges or businesses. So, like, if we don't get the budget in on time, you can't blame the white man. The president's from West Africa. You know, it's just us. We're all black guys in suits. So, I mean, probably 20% of our staff are black Republicans. I'm not even a Republican. I'm an independent, although I'm at least on the center right politically. And I mean, our hallway is extremely diverse. I mean, my dean is Fred Williams, who's a big former cop, I think leans conservative, former major in the Kentucky State Police. But a casual buddy and office neighbor is Reginald Thomas, who's actually a Democratic Kentucky State Senator. So, I mean, when students at a state university level school come to an environment like that, I think that they're usually pretty open to the idea they're going to find different opinions. I certainly haven't gotten any hostility. The places where I've heard the craziest student faculty encounter stories, like someone went through a bag of dog crap at Peter Boghossian, or at least at his door, they've actually been all upper middle class white environments. And I think that that's not altogether surprising. So, like, black people tend to vote for conservative Democrats. You know, Kamala Harris is considered a little too far to the left by former prosecutors, considered too far to the left by most black Americans, although they're probably going to hold their noses and vote for her. But I mean, like, you know, Bill Clinton was very popular with the black community. It's an interesting pattern of voting. Kind of everyone's at the 45th percentile politically. It's one of the strangest things you'll ever see. But I mean, the actual Antifa fighters and so on that were arrested during the Black Lives Matter riots were like 78% white. So, I mean, I think where you see the most student rioting, like an unshaven blonde girl in a keffiyeh, like throwing a Molotov, it's always one of these bespoke, almost all Caucasian schools that no one goes to, like Chicago School of the Art Institute or Oberlin or Barnard, like someplace that would be fun to party on a Friday, but like it really doesn't look a lot like the University of Kentucky. So, I mean, I'm fine. People tease me about my politics if we play golf or something. So that's really it. The one thing that I will say about college students is that a lot of them have only heard one half of the story. So, I mean, I'll often ask a class about illegal immigration, and I think I present things pretty fairly. I'll say, well, a lot of these people are hardworking, master carpenters and such. They want to come here. They want a better life. But at the same time, we can measure this impact on traditionally African-American jobs, and should they come or not? And a lot of people will say, what's interesting is that I've heard a lot of this before, if I'm on Vox or if I'm on Teen Vogue or any other site. I've never heard the direct breakdown of how this would impact jobs for black or working class white kids before. There are a lot of Appalachian kids in class as well. I've never heard that breakdown of what President Trump meant by a black job, for that matter. And you go beyond that to basic things like what percentage of people know who Thomas Sowell is? Like, just big dog stuff? What percentage of people know who Teddy Roosevelt is beyond the name? That's something that I think hasn't often been communicated. Milton Friedman, Walter Williams, like the other half of society, Aristotle. What's the argument for traditional Christian virtue? What's the argument for chastity? Although that's not one I make very well, but military bravery. Even the black stuff, like who are the African generals that fought Caesar? Name two. None of that is known. What's known is a very narrow window of kind of progressive thought about race in Vietnam in America. And I think that's one of the things, again, that inspired me to write this book.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't know Thomas Sowell's Anointed versus the Benighted, I mean, I think that's good stuff that people should read. And speaking about good stuff people should read, you mentioned in the book, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, about how in contemporary USA, the national media and academia lean about 93% to the left. So, as someone that wants to get a little bit more balanced perspective, how do you actually find books that have more balance? As someone that has a master's and has done a thesis and whatnot, I mean, the vast majority of people that, of course, write books, they just take their dissertation or their master thesis, turn that into, a nonfiction book, and then the other 90% of nonfiction books are just written by a ghostwriter, whether for marketing purposes or whatnot. So if you're trying to read some nonfiction book to get some actual balance, you have a really hard time I would probably guess that less than 10% of books are nonfiction, are actually written from either independent or kind of a conservative perspective. So what would be your advice on that?
Yeah, I think there are two good things there. First of all, for the listeners that aren't quite sure what you referred to, because we're both, I think, technically academics, with the anointed and benighted theories of knowledge gathering, break that down for a second. Tom Sowell, the great conservative black academic, in my opinion, America's top social scientist of the past 150 to 100 years, he argued that there are two popular theories about how people get knowledge. One is called the theory of the anointed, which is the idea that knowledge is something that almost entirely people with degrees have, basically. It's something that you get from the competition among the upper end of the educated class in kind of scholastic programs, something that's conveyed in peer-reviewed journal articles, and something that's pretty easy for the educated elite to pick up. I mean, he cites an article, I think, in the book where he talks about this division of the anointed, where someone claims that there's actually a difference in the absorption rate of knowledge for someone with an IQ over 130 versus anyone else. So knowledge is something that's very easy for Group X to pick up. It's conveyed in this pretty narrow world, and we really, really should listen to the experts, even if they're in fields that seem completely bullshit, like gender studies. That wasn't said especially well, but that's the vision of the anointed. The vision of the benighted is the idea that knowledge is something that is conveyed. The experts may know more than any one person who's not an expert. But knowledge is something that's conveyed through a range of mechanisms, books, learning experiences, doing things like practicing medicine or practicing law or working in your fields as a farmer, reading a good op-ed in the local newspaper, reading a public intellectual piece that's not peer-reviewed, just blah, 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 almost anything. And there's far more knowledge in circulation in what he calls the intelligent crowd among all the home managers that used to be business women and country lawyers and GP doctors and registered nurses and everybody than there is among the elite at any given time, especially since the elite is prone to crazy fads. The Dutch tulip mania comes to mind, gender comes to mind, so on down the line. So he argues that the vision of the benighted, which is that in general, rules that have existed for a long time in society producing positive results are almost always correct, is superior to the vision of the anointed, which is that the things the top of the intellectual class are saying at any one time are correct. And I completely agree with Sowell. And Sowell actually gives a number of examples. Like he contrasts the move to reduce policing in the 1960s based on the then popular, now debunked psychological idea that a lack of trust in systems led to crime. He describes that, and he contrasts the anointed prediction, which is that as trust grew because police stopped people less, crime would decrease, with the benighted prediction, which is that some people are bad or at least aggressive, high prey drive, and that as police stops decreased, crime would grow. And he points out that what actually happened is that between 1963 and 1993, as I often quote almost verbatim, crime increased 500%. And there are a series of other very empirical predictions like that in the book. I mean, so he talks about sex education in the schools, where schools started explicit pleasure-based sex ed, where there are pictures of like people like actually bending over in the sex ed book, and oral sex is described for 2 or 3 pages. And so the prediction of the Anointed is that people are less likely to do something that no longer seems rebellious. You know, people are driven by these sort of very rich girl motives striking back in society. Prediction of the Benighted, people do things that seem fun that have been explained to them. It's not that hard. Again, did teen sex increase from 1950 to 1980? Yes, of course, it increased 1,000%. This is, the punk era and so on. Again, the Benighted were absolutely correct. So it's a very empirical book. And the idea is just that the things that most people believe based on 1,000 local level tests over time are usually correct. Now, your other question was, where can you go to get information other than the modern, sometimes screwed up media? I think the simplest answer to that is just go to alternative sources that are good. So if you're interested in books, I mean, I would just go on Amazon and sign up for notifications from like intelligent center and right-wing sources, Manhattan Institute, American Enterprise Institute, Regnery Press, which is the biggest conservative publisher, and also some interesting stuff on the left, like Third World Press, which is all the crazy black and feminist stuff, but occasionally comes out with some genuinely interesting product from people in other countries. Wolf, which is again very feminist, edgy, gay stuff, but for queer majority. But going back to the right, where dwells most of the knowledge. I mean, Heather McDonald, whatever she's doing with policing right now, or Ralph Mangel, myself, Thomas Sowell, who's still writing. Just go down, make up a list. Victor Davis Hanson, make up a list of people that you think are intellectuals on the right and center. Subscribe to them, follow their work. I mean, I get probably 50 new books suggested to me every month. So, I mean, even if you say only, 7 to 20% of the entire global nonfiction sector is people that are on your side, that's still, as in the old sales-based idea of it's not that hard to get a date, that's still, 200 books a month or something like that. So you'll be more than prepared for any debate.
Wilfred, as you said, you are independent. Let's say that you hypothetically wrote a book that was called Lies That My Conservative Teacher Told Me. What would be, say, the number one lie coming from the conservative teacher?
I mean, I think that, so what does the right say? First of all, I mean, there aren't that many conservative teachers. I think it would be lies that, what are some lies? I guess a lot of them are just flips of the lies my liberal teacher told me. So a lie my conservative teacher told me would be, one of them would be, it's very hard to be white. You're starting to see this more and more, like this idea of you turn on Twitter and they're like mobs of black guys beating up a white guy. Again, so like interracial crime that's extremely violent is 80 to 90% black on white. But again, there are 5 times as many white guys and it's 3% of crime. I mean, so the person most likely to kill you is your wife. I would make that point. Affirmative action is a reality, but you are likely to be born into a family with about 5 times the baseline wealth of a black family if you're Caucasian. So, I mean, I think that would be one point. The sort of begging bull stuff is pathetic enough from, recently immigrated minorities. We don't need to see burly Irish and Italian guys starting to adopt that posture. That would be one thing. I think some of the extreme abortion stuff would be another thing, where people are saying things like we kill 1 million kids a year. It's important to unpack that. And I've used those lines sometimes in debates with feminist sparring partners, where people will say things like women don't commit acts of violence. And like if you add up infanticide, which certainly is an act of violence, and then just any non-medical, like actual surgical abortion, the total in a typical, not atypical year is like 1,100,000. So, I mean, the response would be like, oh, yeah, you do. You're just not very big. I mean, I'm not sure you'd be any kinder than we were if you were larger. But nonetheless, the vast majority of abortions of DNCs are performed within the first 3 months, involve basically blastocysts, so on down the line. So things like we're massacring children are pretty debatable. So, I'd probably have a chapter breaking down some of the realities of how abortion is presented. Like live action in groups like this will generally blow up images to about 200 times baseline size. Again, I don't find but like the thing is, like, abortion still, I mean, there are a lot of abortions. I don't personally find the conservative lies or exaggerations that are going on right now to be on par with the things in the educational system that the left is doing, because the right isn't running the educational system. So the conservative lies that would be on par were those in the past, like there were only 500,000 Native Americans. We're not really in a position to tell those lies anymore. So I think that's the issue. I mean, so it's not that difficult to be white, but that's just a flip of it's not that difficult to be black. There's some exaggerations of, the red pill stuff. That I think is what I might settle on. Like, what I'm talking about, right? The MRA zone. Women are responsible for 70% of divorces. No, women technically file 70% of the divorce papers. Men cheat just as often. We're just lazy. We don't go in there. Guys only get custody 15% of the time. Bro, guys only apply for custody 20% of the time. We get it 3/4 of the time if you're a young father and you go in there and you're sued. All of that stuff. 80% of the women are dating 20% of the men. No, they're not. Just go to Walmart. I mean, that's absolutely untrue. Like, a lot of that stuff, I think, would be something I'd come back pretty hard on. In fact, I'm just an ordinary looking guy. I mean, I find that women are often desperate for romantic relationships. If you're a guy, you're making $60,000 to $80,000 a year and you know how to wear a jacket and you go to the gym once a week, like, you're going to be not unsought after. I mean, just don't sit around on your ass all day watching porn and playing video games. But I mean, again, the thing is, last point on this, that's not a lie your teacher is telling you. There's a lot of bullshit on the right, but we're not the group that's in charge of 95% of the media, 94% or 93% of academia. I mean, so that is where there's a little bit of a difference. I mean, I'm sure there are right-wing lies in the military and policing, and we should crack down on those. But right now, the group that's in charge of most of the discursive portals in society, I like that term, is the center left. And it's really showing.
You mentioned the lower fertility rate, and one of the major themes of, I think, all your books was just that having these broken families, having the high divorce rate has really kind of destroyed really just generations. You don't have two parents in the household. People get married later. I think you said the fertility rate was 1.7. I think last time I looked it was 1.62, but doesn't really matter. But I had Dr. Daryl Bricker on, who wrote the book Empty Planet. I had the guy who wrote the book Unfriendly Family, I think it was called. And I've had several books on the demographics. But do you think that we will kind of see the family back together again? Is there going to be any push? It seems like with the fourth wave of feminism and the girl boss and all this, the student dad, even if you wanted to get married young, but if both the male and the female both have student dad, like, one person can't stay home if you both have 100,000 in college debt, right? You both got to work. And if you're both working, it's hard to have kids.
I don't think economics has anything to do with this, honestly. Like, I don't think economics has anything to do with this at all. Like, just like when feminists say the issue is that men can be abusive. Yeah, like, men are more abusive than women, physically. That's a key qualifier there. But I mean, no one thinks that men are more abusive than we were in 1940, though. And like, women were, like, letters existed by that point. Telephones existed by that point. Women were as aware of this as they are today. So the point is not men have our flaws. Women know that and knew that. The question is why women are much more sensitive about this now than they were then. Similarly, like, you're talking about incomes today in practice, when you look at the quality of televisions, when you look at the quality of vehicles, can you and your wife share a car? Incomes today are in practice about 6 times what they were in 1950. So you say $100,000 in student loan debt, that's going to be, if you negotiate your debt, maybe a $200 payment per month. Could you live off one $67,000 a year income and both drive Toyotas? Yes, easily. The problem is that nobody wants to do that. I've had this conversation with a lot of young executives that just graduated from my program. Like, well, I mean, this is Kentucky. You can buy a house for $27,000 in a working class neighborhood and just do your thing. I mean, you work at a law firm downtown. Don't tell people where you live for the first 2 years. Bro, I'm not doing that. No way. Absolutely not. I mean, so like the whole trad thing, like, I'll even tease about it. Like, you can put a goat in your backyard. You can do all that stuff you're talking about online. Hell no. Shut up. I mean, it's just nobody actually wants to do what people did in the 1950s. You have one TV in your house, one phone in your house. I mean, maybe you have the cheapest baseline cell phone if you want more than that. You go out to dinner once a week, you have one car, you share it. That is what people used to do to live off one income when they had these kind of debts. And people used to have heavy medical debt for parents they were taking care of, war wounds, post-military, all kind of stuff to take care of. So no, I don't think it's income, and I don't think it is abuse. I certainly don't think it's asexuality from women, like compared to Catholic people in 1945. It's none of the stuff people are talking about. It's the reality that we've seen other options. Like, it's hard to stay down on the farm once you've seen Paris. Like, people now are taking pills that make it possible to not get pregnant. Most people like sex. And if you're early in a marriage, you're having sex 3 or 4 times a week, like, pregnancy would happen. Most men, most young women don't know their cycle down to the day. That doesn't happen anymore. Most people are on birth control for 7 years after the start of a marriage, I believe the term is. So you've got that. And then you have the fact that a marriage starts at 32 for the men. And just do that math. Like, so you're 32 and you're on birth control for, let's say, 5 more years. You can't have kids. That's the ghost in the room. Like, people don't understand human fertility and biology. You're 32 and she's protected for 5 more years. And it's an awkward topic, but you're not going to have children. And by the way, the fertility rate, like, I would agree the all classes fertility rate is between 1.2 and 1.6. But the upper middle class urban fertility rate I gave isn't 1.7, it's 0.7. That means, like, the average couple of 2 has 0.7 kids. So that's less than 1 baby per person. And we're not per 2 people. And we're not unique in that. I mean, South Korea is at 0.8 for the entire country. So I'm sure people double check those numbers and they might find them off by 0.01. But that's something that we really need to do something about. I don't think it's income based at all. I think it is chemical based. I think it is lifestyle based. And it's going to require, what I would do to deal with the fertility crisis to some extent is just be honest early on. Someone like DeSantis, who's mildly autistic enough to do this, should literally just make this part of the health or the sex ed curriculum. Just add a couple lines saying, you're not going to be able to have children after a certain age. These are the effects of birth control on the body. And just tell people this. Same for the men. Like, guys often use this as a way to browbeat women. If you're a man and you're over like 45, like I'm coming up on this window myself in a couple of years, you're going to have all kinds of sperm issues. You're going to have to stay in physical shape at bare minimum to have healthy children. People aren't aware of this. Like, a year or 2 back, I thought about becoming a sperm donor. We're not going to get into some terrible, weird shit here, but like, I was surprised to find you have to be in this state. It was under 33. They were like, nah, you're a couple years over the line. We would have loved you. Like, you're 5'10", high IQ, but nope, you can't do it by law. And nobody knows this. Nobody knows any of this. So I would tell people this kind of stuff, and I think you'd see some change. You'd see a change to like 0.8.
Right. And what's the age for a geriatric pregnancy? Isn't it like a female in their 30s is a geriatric pregnancy?
It's not in their 30s. It's like 29 or 30.
Is it? Yeah. So it's late 20s. Yeah.
It's like you're approaching 30. It's certainly in every state. It's when you hit the 30 mark, because that used to be such a rare time for your first kid. Like, to be a prima gravida, to be having your first baby. And like, again, I'm not going to tell you how I came to this information. I don't think any recent dating partner would be thrilled to have that discussed, but it's just like, people didn't, almost no one until pretty recently would be considering their first child at, say, 34, to pick an age that wouldn't apply to me or anyone I know. And now that's extremely common. And it has consequences. So that, I think, is the cause of this. Like, and we've had so much male female back and forth in the internet world and in all these forums and so on, that I think people have taken almost a hostile position on a lot of this. So you'll often see women say, like, we don't need these men anyway. Like, we're girl bossing, and the issue is that we're saying no to these bum ass dudes. I've seen this with like white and black women. That's actually not what's happening. Women are much more interested in romantic relationships than men are, which is probably good, because otherwise men would be chasing them around with tongues lolling like wolves, given our interest in intimacy and having kids and so on. But I mean, like, women, if anything, desire these sort of relationships, this marriage relationship, marriage bid, 2 kids running around outside, a lot more than guys do. If men were to approach women at 24 and get on their knees and propose, there'd be overjoyed people in this country. If Taylor Swift were to actually get married to Kelsey at one of her concerts, like people would be screaming, throwing flowers down off the balcony. There'd be a million weddings the next day. The issue is that guys are not proposing. And a lot of women who try for that first love relationship at 23 wind up with a quote unquote illegitimate kid from that and get really bitter and disaffected toward guys in general, understandably. And then that's that. I mean, it's a wrap. You're 28 with a 5-year-old son, and you're back on the dating market, and you're going to have problems with a lot of more bum-ass dudes. So what do you do? That's the problem we have to overcome.
You're an entrepreneur and investor. I've saw in some other podcasts, and as I mentioned, you're an assistant professor of political sciences at Kentucky State University. What advice would you give to students for picking a major or what career paths with AI and just kind of the changing landscape? What would just you advise people on that front?
Well, my advice would be to pick something. It's kind of in the middle. I wouldn't pick something that is too practical, like hospitality management, because you're going to be replaced by a robot, like right off the bat. The major you pick should either be something that's actually going to teach you citizenship skills, like political science is pretty good, but the best might be philosophy. And go into that recognizing you're not going to get a job in that field and go work on an elite trading floor. That's what those majors are for. And a lot of people don't understand that, and they come out and they work at a Starbucks. Like one of the jobs I had in Chicago was working at Marcus Evans International, which is like an aggressive British company that tracks down CEOs. Some people there make a lot of money. Some people don't make any. I did pretty well. But it's just a classic bullpen sales trading floor environment. You get a list of numbers. You call people who scream back and forth, these executives. All your money goes up on a board. At that job, we'll only hire you if you had a college degree. And we preferred people that could talk to a C-level executive at a large company. So if you get a degree in philosophy, English literature, that's kind of what you're supposed to be doing. Like you're supposed to apply to elite prep schools for a couple of years, see if you get your dream job. And if not, you go work in ads, marketing, you're a newspaper reporter, that kind of thing. So those jobs will always be there. You're not going to be replaced by a robot as a revolutionary poet who then becomes an ad man. The second category of jobs would be things that actually lead you into a category of work that is professional and that legally probably isn't going to get replaced, like brain surgeon. So that I think is the classic reason to go to college, by the way. Like when people on the right say, like, college is a scam, I kind of want the guy, I'm probably going to get my knees operated on in a couple months. Like I kind of want the guy who's down there drilling holes to have gone to school. I don't really want him to have trained as a witch or to have just done something with the union. So there's this whole idea of it's all just a scam. And this actually, I think this is a big right-wing lie, by the way. Like, young man, you're being lied to. So all the women are whores. The military's gone woke. College, they're just ripping you off. What about engineering school? No, it's all woke. All of this, a lot of this is just BS. Like if you go to the engineering program at Kentucky State or UK, I don't think you're ever going to hear the word woke. You're just going to learn how to build robots. And the same thing's true for medical school. It's true for 90% of law schools. It's true for computer science. So the second category of things you should do if you don't want to get a job that's going to lead you into management, if junior executive work, the second category of things would be one of those. Like you go get your CS degree and then some specific business masters, and then you go into that exact field.
So I need the microphone, I guess, to talk, right? So today's guest has been Dr. Wilfred Reilly, the assistant professor of political sciences at Kentucky State University, co-host of Cut the Bull podcast, author of numerous books, and the one we most talked about today is Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. Just two final questions for you, Dr. Wilfred Reilly. Where can people find you, get a hold of you? You got a pretty big following on Twitter, X, that kind of information. And then after that, just leave us with a final thought related to any of your books or whatever is just on your mind.
All right. So people can find me pretty easily just by searching my name. It's Wilfred Reilly. It's WILFRED REILLY. And if you do that, you'll find my Twitter, my old Facebook page, my website, which is really just a link to the KSU portal. I mean, but all that stuff, my books, which have mostly been categorical bestsellers on Amazon, that kind of thing. I encourage you to do that. I'll talk to you. And I think my piece of advice would be, I'm always tempted to say some nonsense like just keep watching the skies. But my actual piece of advice would be trust your common sense. Really, and I think that to some extent is it. There's a facility of logic that everyone that would watch a show like this has. It's what makes jury duty possible. It's what makes you able to publish an op-ed in the best newspapers in the country. It's what lets you read scientific research when you go to a state university level school. So if someone's saying something that seems completely nonsensical, like some women have 9-inch penises, understand why you think that's crazy. Go to some of those center and right focused forums that I've described and look for research that kind of indicates that probably would be crazy, but trust your common sense. Don't be bamboozled.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.